For over 2,000 years, his name has shaped civilizations, inspired faith, and sparked endless debate. But behind the stories, the miracles, and the belief, was there truly a man called Jesus of Nazareth? What do ancient historians, archaeology, and science really tell us about him? This is the search for the real Jesus, the man behind the myth.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty huge. The historical person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
He's this figure just completely woven into, well, everything faith, culture, history for 2,000 years. But what we want to do here, looking at the sources you've pulled together, is try and, gently set aside the icon for a moment and really examine this first-century Jewish wander teacher through the lens of historical science. What can we actually know?
That's exactly the goal. And it's crucial we state the big constraint right up front. Usually for ancient figures, historians hunt for primary sources stuff written by the person. With Jesus, well, we don't have any. Zero.
Nothing at all from his own hand.
Nope. All the detailed accounts, the Gospels and such, they were written down decades later. We're talking second, maybe third-hand information, mostly built on stories passed down orally. For a historian, that immediately throws up some big red flags about reliability.
Right.
Especially because, let's be honest, the folks writing these texts had a clear goal: promoting faith, building a movement, missionizing.
Okay, so that's the core challenge, isn't it? The sources are from believers, and they're written down long after the fact.
Precisely. Which is why we absolutely have to stick to the tough standards of historical science. If we want to say, historically speaking, yes, this person existed, and yes, these specific things happened, we can't just rely on the faith documents alone. We need what historians call the key constraint: independent sources. We need outside proof.
Outside proof, meaning people who weren't part of the early Christian movement.
Exactly. We need verification from non-Christian writers, people just recording events who had zero interest in spreading the faith. They need to confirm the basic facts we find in the Christian accounts.
So without that outside confirmation, we just have the story of a religious belief system, not necessarily a confirmed historical person.
That's the crux of it. This two independent sources rule is fundamental. It allows us to move from this is what his followers believed to this is what we can historically verify.
Okay, let's start that search then. Who are these non-Christian witnesses? Who helps anchor Jesus in actual verifiable history outside of the New Testament?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because we do have them. The rule requires looking beyond the early church, and thankfully, history provides. The key names pop up in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries.
All right, who are the main ones, the sort of crown witnesses for his existence?
The first, and arguably the most significant, is Flavius Josephus.
Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian.
Right. Yes. He was writing in the late 1st century, documenting the history and politics of Judea. His work, Antiquities of the Jews, is vital because it covers the exact period we're talking about, Jesus' lifetime and the years immediately after.
And what does Josephus tell us that's relevant here?
He gives us something incredibly specific. He reports the condemnation and the execution, specifically mentioning crucifixion of Jesus. And crucially, he names the Roman official responsible, Pontius Pilate.
Okay, so that's huge. It's not just Jesus existed, it's Jesus was executed by this specific Roman governor.
Monumental. It links Jesus directly to a known, verifiable Roman prefect and identifies the political act that ended his life. That alone is a massive anchor point for historical certainty.
But Josephus, there's that controversial passage, isn't there? The Testimonium Flavianum. Everyone always brings that up.
Yes. The elephant in the room. You're right. We have to address it. It's a classic case study for the historical critical method, which we'll dig into more later. Josephus is absolutely a crown witness. But that specific passage about Jesus in his Antiquities, well, scholars almost universally agree it's been tampered with.
Tampered with? How? By later Christians, you mean?
It certainly looks that way. The passage as it stands contains lines that sound very, very Christian. Things like calling Jesus the Messiah, saying he worked wonders, maybe was more than a man, and crucially that he appeared again alive on the 3rd day.
Things Josephus, as a Jew working under Roman patronage, probably wouldn't have written.
Highly unlikely. It sounds like later Christian scribes copying the text maybe couldn't resist adding a bit of, let's call it, pious improvement.
So historians have to kind of perform surgery on the text, try to figure out what Josephus originally wrote.
Exactly. Textual criticism. And the broad consensus, really, the vast majority view, is that Josephus did mention Jesus. The core of the passage is likely authentic.
What's the core, then? What do most scholars agree Josephus actually said?
The likely original core is something like this. Jesus was a wise man, a teacher. He gained a following among Jews and even non-Jews, and Pilate, responding to accusations from Jewish leaders, condemned him to be crucified. We basically strip away the overt theological claims, the Messiah part, the resurrection, and we're left with the bare historical facts of his life, his following, and his execution under a specific Roman official.
Okay, so even with the controversy, Josephus provides one solid, independent anchor confirming Jesus and his execution by Pilate. Anchor 1 established. Who's next?
Next, we look to the Roman side, specifically the historian Cornelius Tacitus.
Tacitus, another heavyweight Roman historian, writing a bit later, early 2nd century.
That's right, in his annals. Tacitus is incredibly valuable because he gives us the perspective of the Roman elite, the state's view, looking back at the origins of this troublesome group, the Christians.
And what does Tacitus say? Does he mention Jesus directly?
He does. He's describing the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero around 64 AD. Tacitus reports that Nero, looking for a scapegoat, blamed this group called Christianos, Christians who were already unpopular in Rome. And then Tacitus explains where their name came from. He says it derived from Christus.
Christus, Latin for Christ.
Right. And Tacitus states that this Christus, the founder of the movement, had suffered the extreme penalty execution during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Wow. So Tacitus independently confirms the founder's name or title, Christus, and his execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That matches Josephus perfectly.
It's incredibly powerful corroboration.
Huh.
Two major independent sources, one Roman Jewish, one purely Roman, pointing to the same core facts. A founder figure executed by Pilate.
That really strengthens the case. Okay, so we have Josephus and Tacitus. Any other non-Christian perspectives? What about from within Jewish tradition itself, besides Josephus?
Yes, there's another important, though slightly different, source. The Babylonian Talmud.
The Talmud. That's a foundational collection of Jewish law and tradition, compiled much later, though, right?
Much later, mainly around the 3rd to 5th centuries AD, but critically, it draws on much older oral and written traditions that were circulating earlier. And in one section, the Tractate Sanhedrin, there's a passage that mentions a figure named Jeshu.
Jeshu, which is related to Jesus' Hebrew name, Yeshua.
Exactly. And this passage reports that Jeshu was executed, specifically that he was hanged on the eve of the Passover.
Hanged, not crucified. But the timing, Passover, matches the gospel accounts.
Right. The method differs slightly in the description, but hanged could be a generic term for that kind of execution or reflect a different tradition. The key points are the name, the execution, and the timing linked to Passover. Now, it's important to note this Talmudic reference is quite hostile. It accuses Jeshu of sorcery and leading Israel astray. It's definitely not a friendly source.
But that hostility almost makes it more valuable historically, doesn't it? It shows even Jesus' opponents acknowledge his existence and execution.
Precisely. It's confirmation from an unsympathetic source. So when you put these three together, Josephus, with the critical caveats, Tacitus, clear and Roman, and the Talmud, hostile but corroborating, you absolutely satisfy that two independent sources rule. The historical existence of Jesus and his execution under Pilate are established with a very high degree of certainty based on these non-Christian accounts alone.
Okay, that's a really solid foundation using external sources. Now let's turn inward to the documents most people associate with Jesus' life story. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They provide all the details, the teachings, the miracles. But given what you said earlier, written decades later, by believers, how reliable can they actually be as historical records?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Their reliability really depends on how you read them. They are historical documents in the sense that they come from a specific time and place, but they're fundamentally faith documents. Their primary purpose wasn't objective history writing in the modern sense.
So when were they actually written? What's the timeline we're looking at?
The scholarly consensus puts their composition generally between, say, 70 AD and maybe 110 or 120 AD. The earliest one is almost universally agreed to be the Gospel of Mark.
Mark comes first, around 70 AD.
Yeah, probably right around the time of, or just after, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. That event was hugely traumatic and likely spurred the writing process.
70 AD. Okay, so even the earliest gospel was written maybe 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion. That's a significant gap.
It is. And it means the authors weren't eyewitnesses to most of the events they describe, certainly not Jesus' birth or early life. They were compiling stories, traditions, and sayings that had been circulating.
What about the other Gospels? Matthew and Luke often sound very similar to Mark, and then there's John, which feels quite different.
Right. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning they can be seen together because they share so much material and follow a similar structure. That similarity isn't an accident. It's a key clue for historians.
Oh, so?
Well, the dominant theory, called the two-source hypothesis, suggests that Matthew and Luke didn't just write their accounts independently. They both used Mark's gospel as a primary source, often copying large chunks of it.
So they were building on Mark's narrative.
Exactly. They were essentially editing and expanding Mark's framework. This means when you read parallel stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're often not reading three independent accounts of the same event. You're reading Mark and then two later versions that used Mark as a base.
That changes how you weigh their evidence then. It's not three witnesses, it's more like one witness and two based on the first.
Correct. But Matthew and Luke also share material that isn't in Mark, mostly sayings and teachings of Jesus.
Right. Where'd that stuff come from?
This leads us to the other part of the two-source hypothesis, the hypothetical Q source.
Q, I've heard of Q.
Yeah.
Stands for quell.
Yeah.
German
Yeah.
source, right. But it's hypothetical. We don't actually have a copy.
No physical copy has ever been found. It's a theoretical document that scholars reconstruct based on the material common to Matthew and Luke but absent from Mark. The idea is that Q was likely a collection of Jesus' sayings, his teachings, his logia, and importantly, based on its content and structure, scholars think Q might be even older than Mark, maybe compiled as early as 50 AD.
50 AD. That's much closer to Jesus' actual lifetime, only maybe 20 years after the crucifixion.
Potentially, yes. If Q existed, it could represent one of the very earliest written records we have of what Jesus actually taught. Not a full narrative, but a collection of his core messages.
So Mark provides the narrative framework, Q provides the sayings, and Matthew and Luke combine them, adding their own material too.
That's the basic model, yes. And John's gospel seems to draw on different independent traditions and has a more theological, reflective style. It stands somewhat apart from the synoptics.
Okay, this is where that historical critical method you mentioned comes in, right? To sort through these layers of sources and traditions.
Precisely. The historical critical method, HCM, is the toolkit modern biblical scholars, including theologians, use to analyze these texts scientifically. It's not about accepting or rejecting faith claims. It's about understanding the Bible in its original context. Who wrote this text? When? Why? What sources did they use? What was their agenda?
So it questions the surface reading.
It systematically questions assumptions. It uses tools from history, archaeology, literary analysis, sociology, everything available to understand how these texts came to be and what historical information we can reasonably extract from them. It helps us try to separate, for instance, what might go back to the historical Jesus versus what might be a later interpretation or theological development by the early church or the gospel writers themselves.
But how did this information even survive for 40 or 50 years before Mark or Q were written down? Today, we'd consider relying purely on memory for that long. Totally unreliable.
That's us projecting our modern literate culture onto the past. First-century Palestine was overwhelmingly an oral culture. Literacy wasn't widespread. Oral transmission, passing stories, teachings, histories down by word of mouth through memorization wasn't just common. It was the standard way important information was preserved. People were trained in memory techniques.
So what we might see as unreliable Chinese whispers, they saw as a valid way to preserve tradition.
Exactly. It was an accepted and respected method, especially for sacred or important community narratives. Now, does that mean things didn't change or get adapted in the telling? Of course not. Oral tradition is fluid. But the HCM tries to account for that, looking for patterns, core elements, things that are consistently repeated across different strands of the tradition, which suggests they might be older or more authentic.
Okay, let's apply this method. Let's take one of the most famous stories, the Christmas story, the birth of Jesus. It's iconic, but how does it hold up under this kind of historical scrutiny? Was Jesus really born in Bethlehem?
The birth narratives. This is a perfect example of where the HCM reveals a fascinating tension between historical reporting and theological messaging.
What's the first thing you notice when you apply the method?
The first thing is you look at the oldest gospel, Mark, and Mark says absolutely nothing about Jesus' birth. No Bethlehem, no manger, no wise men, no shepherds, nothing.
Mark starts later, with Jesus' adulthood.
Mark starts with Jesus' baptism as an adult by John the Baptist. When Mark does mention Jesus' origins, he simply calls Nazareth his hometown, or Patras.
And the Gospel of John.
John also doesn't have a birth narrative. Like Mark, when people refer to Jesus' origins, they call him Jesus from Nazareth, the son of Joseph.
So the two Gospels, potentially drawing on the oldest traditions, either don't mention the birth or place him firmly in Nazareth.
Correct. The elaborate birth stories involving Bethlehem are found only in Matthew and Luke, which we know are later Gospels.
So why the strong insistence on Bethlehem in Matthew and Luke? If the older tradition pointed to Nazareth, why change it?
This is where history takes a backseat to theology. The location Bethlehem versus Nazareth becomes fundamentally a theological requirement, not just a biographical detail.
A theological requirement. Why?
Because of Old Testament prophecy. Specifically, the prophet Micah predicted that Israel's ruler, the Messiah, would come from Bethlehem, the city of King David.
Ah, King David's connection.
Exactly. For Matthew and Luke, who are writing to convince their audiences that Jesus is the promised Messiah, fulfilling prophecy is paramount. If Jesus is the Messiah, the successor to King David, then he must have been born in David's city, Bethlehem.
So the narrative needs him to be born there to fit the messianic script, regardless of where he might actually have been born historically.
That's what the HCM suggests. The location is driven by the need to fulfill prophecy and establish Jesus' messianic credentials according to Scripture. It's a theological statement embedded in a historical narrative.
That's a critical distinction. The story serves a purpose beyond just recording biographical facts, but Luke tries to give a historical reason for the journey to Bethlehem, right? The census.
He does. Luke's narrative is the one with the famous journey of Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of a census ordered by Emperor Augustus. Everyone had to go to their ancestral town to register.
That sounds historically plausible. The Romans loved their censuses for tax purposes.
They did, and Luke ties it to specific historical figures. He says the census was decreed by Emperor Augustus and occurred when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Okay, can we verify that? Augustus, Quirinius, a census in Syria?
Yes, we can check the Roman records, and also Josephus confirms some of this. Augustus was indeed emperor, ruling from 27 BC to 14 AD, and historical evidence, including Josephus, confirms that there was a Roman census in the province of Syria, which included Judea, conducted by Governor Quirinius.
So far, so good. Luke seems to be grounding his story in real Roman administration.
He does. But here's the problem. Josephus tells us when that specific census under Quirinius took place. It was in 6 AD.
6 AD, okay. And when was Jesus supposedly born according to Luke's narrative?
Luke explicitly states that Jesus' birth, and therefore this census journey, happened during the reign of King Herod the Great.
King Herod.
Yeah.
The one famous for rebuilding the temple and meeting the wise men in Matthew's account.
That's the one, also a real documented historical figure, but the historical records are very clear. King Herod the Great died in 4 BC.
Wait, so Luke says the census happened under Herod, but Herod died in 4 BC. And the actual census under Quirinius that Luke seems to be referring to happened in 6 AD.
Exactly. The dates are completely off. They do not fit together at all, as the source material bluntly puts it.
10 years difference.
At least. The well-documented census under Quirinius happened a full decade after Herod died. Luke's timeline, linking Herod and the Quirinius census for the birth narrative, is historically impossible.
So the historical anchor Luke tries to use actually contradicts his own narrative time frame.
It does. It seems Luke needed a reason to get Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy, and he used the memory of a real Roman census, but he got the timing completely wrong, possibly conflating it with other registrations or just misremembering the details decades later.
What does that mean for knowing Jesus' actual birth year?
It means we can't reliably determine it from the Gospels. Because of these clear historical contradictions, especially the census issue, historians conclude the exact date or even year of Jesus' birth is historically uncertain based on the biblical accounts. The narrative function seems to have overridden chronological accuracy.
Fascinating. The story serves the theology, even if the historical details get blurred. Okay, let's move past the birth then, to the period where we have more agreement. His public ministry. What did the sources tell us about those years as a wander preacher, mostly in Galilee? What was his core message, and why did it eventually attract the lethal attention of Rome?
Right, his public activity. This is centered mainly in Galilee, which was part of the Roman Empire, but had its own distinct character, often a bit rebellious. The sources consistently portray him as this charismatic, itinerant preacher. He didn't seem to have a fixed base. He moved around, gathering crowds, teaching, healing.
And the core theme.
The kingdom of God. This phrase is central. He proclaimed that God's kingdom, or God's rule, was near breaking into the world.
What did that look like in practice? Was he calling for political revolution?
His actions were certainly socially radical, which inevitably had political implications, even if he wasn't leading an army. He consistently reached out to the marginalized, the people on the fringes of society. Think about it. Defending prostitutes, eating with tax collectors, who were seen as collaborators with Rome, caring for the sick and ritually impure, paying attention to children who had little status. These were provocative acts challenging the established social and religious hierarchies.
And his teachings, things like loving your enemies, the critiques of wealth.
Exactly. Radical stuff. He challenged strict interpretations of religious law, like the Sabbath rules, often positioning his authority alongside or even above traditional interpretations. He spoke about a reversal of fortunes, the last being first, the poor inheriting the kingdom.
From Rome's perspective, even if he wasn't explicitly calling for revolt, talk of a kingdom of God in occupied territory must have sounded suspicious.
Extremely suspicious. Any talk of a new kingdom, a new king, a new loyalty that wasn't Caesar was potentially seditious. It could easily be interpreted as undermining the Pax Romana, the whole system of Roman dominion and the emperor's authority.
And wasn't there also this undercurrent or tradition connecting Jesus to King David's line?
Yes, that's crucial. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke make a point of tracing his lineage back to David. Whether historically accurate or not, the claim, or even the rumor that he might be a Davidic descendant, a potential heir to the Jewish throne, would have massively amplified Roman fears. A potential king of the Jews was a direct political threat.
What was the general Roman attitude towards potential troublemakers in Judea at that time? Who was emperor?
The emperor during Jesus' ministry and crucifixion was Tiberius. He ruled from 14 to 37 AD. And Tiberius had a reputation, especially later in his reign, for being quite paranoid, suspicious, and absolutely ruthless in crushing any perceived dissent or rebellion in the provinces. Judea was already known as a volatile region. Any sign of messianic fervor or popular unrest was typically met with swift and brutal force by the Roman governor. It was a political tinderbox.
So Jesus' message, his actions, the Davidic connection, all happening under Tiberius' suspicious eye, it created a collision course.
It seems inevitable looking back. His ministry, regardless of his ultimate intentions, was perceived by the authorities, both Roman and some collaborating Jewish leaders, as politically dangerous.
Which brings us directly to the climax, the trial and execution. We've already established this happened under Pontius Pilate, confirmed by Josephus and Tacitus. What other concrete, verifiable historical traces do we have for the key players involved in that final drama? Let's focus on Pilate first.
Pilate is probably the figure in the Gospel Passion narratives with the strongest external historical verification. We know he was the Roman prefect or governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. His role in condemning Jesus is, as we said, confirmed by Tacitus and Josephus.
And beyond the texts, is there physical evidence?
Yes, and it's quite definitive. It's the Pilate stone.
Tell us about that.
It's an amazing archaeological find discovered about 30 or maybe 40 years ago now, during excavations at the Roman theater in Caesarea Maritima, which was the Roman administrative capital of Judea. It's a limestone block, and it was originally part of a dedication inscription for a building, probably a temple, that Pilate had commissioned in honor of Emperor Tiberius.
And the inscription mentions him.
Clearly, it reads, Tiberium Pontius Pilatus Prefectus Iudaeae, identifying Pontius Pilate as the prefect of Judea who dedicated this Tiberium.
Wow. So we have his name, his specific title, prefect tied to Judea, found right there in the region he governed.
Exactly. It's rock-solid archaeological proof of his existence, his position, and his tenure. It removes any doubt that the man named in the Gospels as Jesus' judge was a real historical figure holding that specific office.
And we know a bit about how he operated.
We know prefects like Pilate held immense power, including the power of life and death, the Chasis Gladii. When in Jerusalem, he likely operated out of Herod the Great's former palace. His primary job was to maintain Roman order and collect taxes. He answered directly to Tiberius. Allowing a popular figure hailed as King of the Jews to continue unchecked would have been a massive political risk for him personally. His career, possibly his life, depended on keeping the peace.
What about the other key figure mentioned in the trial narratives, the high priest, Caiaphas?
Caiaphas is also historically attested. He's mentioned not only in the Gospels, but also confirmed by Josephus as serving as high priest for an unusually long period, roughly 18 to 36 AD, which covers the time of Jesus' ministry and crucifixion. His position as high priest under Roman occupation was inherently political. He owed his appointment and lengthy tenure to Roman favor, likely Pilate's predecessor and then Pilate himself. He had to collaborate to stay in power.
Is there archaeological evidence for Caiaphas too? I seem to remember something about an ossuary, a bone box.
Yes, in 1990, an ossuary was discovered in Jerusalem bearing the inscribed name Joseph, son of Caiaphas, and Jehoseph bar Caiapher. Since Josephus gives the high priest's full name as Joseph Caiaphas, many believe this ossuary contained his actual bones.
But is that certain?
It's archaeologically plausible and quite intriguing, but unlike the Pilate stone, the identification isn't universally accepted. There's still some scholarly debate about whether it's definitely the high priest Caiaphas. So his historical existence is confirmed by Josephus, but the ossuary is more of a maybe.
Okay. Now, this brings us to a crucial point you touched on earlier, the method of execution. Why crucifixion? Why not stoning if the Jewish authorities were involved?
This is absolutely fundamental for understanding the event historically. The fact that Jesus was crucified tells us definitively who held the ultimate authority and why he was killed. Crucifixion was a distinctively Roman form of execution, typically reserved for slaves, rebels, and non-Roman citizens convicted of serious crimes like sedition.
The Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, couldn't order a crucifixion.
No. Under Roman rule, the Sanhedrin had authority over religious matters and local disputes, and could likely impose punishments like flogging or potentially even stoning for certain religious offenses like blasphemy, although even their capital powers might have been limited by this period. But they absolutely did not have the authority to crucify someone. Only the Roman governor Pilate held that power, the ius gladiae.
So if the charge had been purely religious, like blasphemy, the Jewish penalty would have been stoning.
Correct. The fact that Jesus was crucified points overwhelmingly to a Roman verdict on political grounds. He was executed by the Roman state as a perceived threat to Roman authority, likely under the charge of sedition, claiming to be a king. This aligns perfectly with the Roman perspective we saw in Tacitus and the context of Tiberius's rule.
The execution method itself becomes a piece of historical evidence about the nature of the crime in Roman eyes.
Precisely. It was a political execution carried out by the Roman state.
And crucifixion was designed to be a public horror show, right? A deterrent. Where did it actually happen? People today walk the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. Is that the historical path?
The Via Dolorosa. That's another instance where tradition and history diverge quite significantly. The route pilgrims follow today, the Way of the Cross, was largely established by the Franciscans much later, starting mainly in the 18th century.
So it's not based on first-century geography.
Not accurately, no. The main issue is that the planners didn't fully account for how Jerusalem's city layout has changed over 2 millennia. The Jerusalem of Jesus' time, particularly its northern wall, was located further south than the current old city walls built much later by the Ottomans.
Meaning the traditional site of the execution, Golgotha, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now stands, would have been outside the city walls back then.
Exactly, and that fits perfectly with what we know about Roman and Jewish practices. 2 requirements had to be met for the execution site. 1, according to Jewish law regarding ritual purity and death, executions had to take place outside the city walls. 2, for Roman purposes, the site needed to be highly visible to the public passing by on major roads to maximize the deterrent effect. Rome wanted everyone to see what happened to rebels.
So what was that specific location like? What does archaeology tell us about the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Archaeology there and under the nearby Redeemer Church has revealed something fascinating. The area, in the 1st century, was actually an abandoned limestone quarry.
A quarry?
Yes. There were leftover rock formations, bits of ground unsuitable for building or farming. One prominent rocky outcrop would have stood there, unusable for construction. This high, unusable rock face, located just outside the city wall of the time, maybe only 40 or 50 meters away, as the source notes would have been perfect.
Perfect for what?
Perfect for a place of execution. It meets both criteria, outside the walls, yet highly visible from the northern city gate and nearby roads. It was a ready-made stage for Rome's brutal public spectacles.
That paints a grim picture. Just a rocky wasteland right outside the city, chosen for its visibility.
It does, and it highlights the political and deterrent purpose behind the crucifixion.
What about the details of the crucifixion itself? The sign, the INRI plaque, the nailing. Do we have non-biblical evidence for those practices?
We do have confirmation for some key elements from Roman sources. The practice of carrying a placard or titulus announcing the condemned person's crime was a known Roman custom. We have mentions of this in writers like Suetonius. It was part of the public shaming and warning.
So the INRI sign, Isis Nazarenus Rex Idiorum, fits that Roman practice.
Perfectly. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It explicitly states the charge, claiming kingship, a political crime against Rome. The sign itself reinforces the political nature of the execution.
And the physical act. How were people actually nailed?
Archaeological evidence for crucifixion victims is rare because bodies were usually left to decay or be eaten by animals. But there's one famous find from Givat Hamivtar near Jerusalem, an ossuary containing the bones of a man named Yehohanan, crucified around the same time as Jesus. His heel bone still had a large iron nail driven through it, sideways, through the ankle bones. This suggests victims weren't necessarily nailed through the flat part of the foot, but through the stronger ankle area to provide better support and ensure immobility while maximizing pain.
Gruesome, but historically specific. So putting it all together, the timing, the place, the method.
We can say with high historical confidence, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, likely between 30 and 34 AD, during the Passover festival, on a site just outside the walls of Jerusalem, executed under the authority of Pontius Pilate for perceived political sedition.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground, from the external witnesses to the gospel sources, the birth narratives, the ministry, the trial, the execution. Let's try to synthesize this for listeners. After going through all this evidence, separating historical fact from theological interpretation, using the historical critical method, what's the ultimate takeaway? What's the bottom line?
Well, we started with that core requirement. Independent sources. We couldn't just rely on the Gospels, which were written by believers aiming to spread their faith. We needed external, non-Christian verification for the basic facts. And we found it. We have Josephus, the Jewish historian, confirming Jesus, his following, and his crucifixion under Pilate, even if we have to critically analyze parts of his text. We have Tacitus, the Roman historian, independently confirming Christus as the founder, executed by Pilate under Tiberius. We even have the Talmud, hostile as it is, acknowledging Jeshu and his execution around Passover time. Plus, we have the undeniable archaeological proof of Pilate's existence and position.
So the combined weight of evidence is strong.
Very strong. The general agreement across these different types of sources, Roman, Jewish, Christian, archaeological, regarding his existence and execution under Pilate, leads historians to a firm conclusion.
And that final historical verdict is?
Jesus was, without any serious historical doubt, a real historical person. A Jewish man, a teacher and preacher in first century Galilee and Judea, whose activities led to his execution by the Roman authorities. The existence of Jesus isn't really the big debate among critical historians anymore. The real work, the real challenge, lies in using the HCM to carefully sift through the details presented in the Gospels. It's about distinguishing the probable historical core, his teachings, his focus on the kingdom of God, his conflict with authorities, his crucifixion from the layers of later theological interpretation or narrative shaping.
Like the Bethlehem versus Nazareth issue or the precise dating of the census.
Exactly. Recognizing why a story might be told a certain way, like the need for a Bethlehem birth to fulfill prophecy, is often more historically revealing than trying to prove the literal accuracy of every single detail. We need to understand the function of the stories within the faith communities that preserved them.
So understanding the why behind the story is as important as the what. That seems like the key takeaway here. We have solid proof for Pilate, we see the historical conflicts like the census dates, and we understand why Bethlehem became a theological necessity, even if historically questionable.
Right. The historical investigation confirms the man and the manner of his death. The deeper analysis reveals how his followers interpreted those events to create meaning and build a movement. And maybe a final thought to leave people with, connecting this historical figure to his immense legacy. You could look at the German concept of Wirkungsgeschichte, the history of a person's or event's influence and effects over time. Based purely on the historical sources, Jesus' actual ministry was relatively short, localized, and ended, frankly, in failure and execution by the dominant power.
A common fate for messianic figures in that era.
Very common. But his Wirkungsgeschichte, his actual world-changing impact, didn't really ignite during his lifetime. It exploded after his death, fueled entirely by his followers' profound belief that he had been resurrected.
So the belief about the historical event becomes the driving force.
It seems so. Consider how that belief in a specific event, the resurrection, something historians cannot prove or disprove, using standard methods transformed everything. It turned a crucified Galilean preacher, a victim of Roman power politics, into the central figure of a global religion. It's fascinating how the interpretation and conviction surrounding a historical figure, not just the figure himself, became such an immense historical force in its own right. That transition itself is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story.